Welcome back to Family Ties and Lies, the channel where blood is thicker than water, but secrets are the thickest of all. Every family has a perfect smile for the cameras. But what happens when the doors finally close? We know that behind every flawless holiday dinner lies a hidden web of deception waiting to unravel. Here, we dig into the most shocking family dramas, bitter betrayals, and dark mysteries that people try to bury forever. Whether it is a brutal feud or a hidden past, we uncover the absolute truth. Grab your snack, get comfortable, and hit that subscribe button right now. The ultimate family secrets are about to be exposed. She had spent her whole life making sure everyone else was fed. That was the simplest way to explain who I was, and I suppose it is the truest. For 67 years I had risen before the rest of the world, pressed my hands into dough while the sky was still the color of cold iron, and asked for nothing in return except the quiet satisfaction of watching people eat something I made and forget, for a moment, whatever was hurting them. I never thought of myself as important. That was the mistake everyone made about me, including, for a long while, myself. Before I tell you what they did to me, do me one small kindness. Leave a comment and tell me the name of the town you are listening from. I like to know how far this story travels and how many of you are out there in your own kitchens, your own quiet lives, and then settle in. Because what happened at that dinner table will stay with you long after it ends. My name is Eleanor Whitcomb. The restaurant was called Whitcomb's Wharf, and it sat at the edge of the harbor in Camden, Maine, where the fishing boats came in at dawn, and the fog rolled off the water so thick some mornings you could not see the end of the pier. My husband Walter and I opened it 40 years ago with almost nothing, a second-hand stove, a handful of recipes I carried in my head, and the stubborn certainty of 2 young people who did not know enough to be afraid. He worked the front of the house. He shook the hands and told the stories and made every stranger feel like an old friend. And I stayed in the back, in the heat and the steam, where the real work lived. We were a good pair that way. People saw Walter. People remembered me only as a warmth they could not quite name. Walter died 26 months before the night I am about to tell you about. A bad heart, the doctors said, though I have come to believe that grief and exhaustion did as much to him as anything that showed up on a chart. He went to sleep one November evening and simply did not wake, and the world I had spent 4 decades building suddenly had a hole in the center of it the exact size of a man. For 2 years I went quiet. I want to be honest about that, because I think a lot of women will know what I mean. It was not that I fell apart. It was that I shrank. I let the loud people fill the rooms I used to fill. I told myself I was tired, that I was old, that perhaps it was time to step back and let the young ones carry things forward. And the young one most eager to carry things forward was my daughter-in-law, Sloane. She had married my son Tom 15 years earlier. She was 41 now, beautiful in the way that makes a room go still when she enters it, and she had a smile she could turn on like a kitchen light. She called me Mom in front of company. She never once called me Mom when it was only the two of us. I had noticed that over the years, the way you notice a draft in a house, a small persistent cold that you learn to stop mentioning. The anniversary dinner was Sloane's idea. 40 years of Whitcomb's Wharf, she said, deserved a celebration. The whole town should come. We should honor everything Walter and I had built. She said his name, the way she always said it, like a key she had learned would open me, and I let it. I spent 2 weeks cooking the lobster stew that had been on our very first menu, the brown bread my own mother taught me to make, the blueberry buckle that Walter swore could end wars. I set the long table with the mismatched china we had collected over 40 years, every plate carrying a memory, and I lit the candles. And for a few hours the restaurant smelled like it used to, like a place worth coming home to. They all came. My daughter Grace, who is the quiet one, the steady one, with her husband and her children, old neighbors, fishermen who had eaten my chowder for 30 years, Ruby Aldous, who is 88 and has sat at the corner table every Friday since the year we opened, watching the harbor with eyes that miss nothing, and Tom, my son, who came in looking tired and would not quite meet my gaze, and Sloane behind him, in a dark green dress that cost more than my first stove, moving through the room like she already owned it. The dinner was good, I will allow myself that. There was laughter and a toast and a story about Walter that made 3 people cry without meaning to. And then, somewhere between the stew and the dessert, Sloane stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room went soft and attentive, the way rooms do when a beautiful woman decides to speak. I knew. I think I knew before she said a word. There is a particular stillness certain people get just before they hurt you, a kind of gathering, and I had felt it from her once or twice over the years and learned to distrust it. Eleanor, she said, and then caught herself and smiled and corrected it to something warmer. Mom. She let the warmth settle over the table. We have all been thinking about the future, about what makes sense going forward. And I think with everyone here, with the family together on this special night, it is the right moment to share some news. The candles burned low. Somewhere in the kitchen behind me, a clock ticked. The restaurant, she said, is not sustainable the way things are. We have had an offer, a wonderful offer, from a hospitality group that loves what this place represents. And honestly, Mom, the work here is simply too much for you now. You have given 40 years. You deserve to rest. She paused, and her smile never wavered. So we think it is best, she said, if you step away. 60 days should be plenty of time to make the transition comfortable. The room did not breathe. Tom looked down at his plate. Ruby's old hands went still on the table, and Eleanor Whitcomb, 67 years old, set down the wooden spoon I had been holding without even realizing I still held it. They were all waiting for me to cry. I could feel it in the room, that terrible held breath, the way every face had turned toward me with a mixture of pity and dread, and, in one or two cases, something closer to appetite. They expected the old woman to crumble. They expected tears or pleading, or the slow collapse of a widow who has just been told that the last thing she built is being taken from her hands. Sloane expected it most of all. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the patient tilt of her head, the way she had already arranged her features into the gentle sympathy of someone prepared to comfort a grieving mother-in-law for the cameras of memory. Instead, I smiled. I did not plan it. It rose up in me from somewhere very old and very quiet, a place I had not visited in a long time. It was not a bitter smile, and it was not a brave one, the kind people wear when they are trying not to fall apart. It was something else. It was the smile of a woman who has just heard a person reveal, completely and without knowing it, exactly who they are. It was almost gratitude. For 2 years I had wondered, in the back of my mind, whether I had imagined the coldness in Sloane, whether grief had made me suspicious and unkind. Now I knew. She had stood at my husband's anniversary table, in front of my whole town, and handed me 60 days like a sentence. There was a strange relief in finally seeing the thing clearly. Sloane's smile flickered. Just barely, just enough that I caught it. She had prepared for tears and gotten something she did not have a script for. "Mom," she said again, and the warmth in her voice had thinned. "Are you all right? I know this is a lot to take in." "I am perfectly all right," I said. My voice came out even and calm, calmer than I had expected. "Thank you. Sloane, you have given me a great deal to think about." That was all. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I had learned, somewhere across 40 years of running a kitchen during a dinner rush, that the loudest person in the room is almost never the one in control. I picked up the wooden spoon again, the one Walter had carved for me our second winter, worn smooth now and dark with use, and I carried it back toward the kitchen as though nothing unusual had occurred. Behind me, the silence broke into a low murmur, the awkward sound of people who do not know what they have just witnessed and are afraid to say so out loud. My daughter Grace caught me near the kitchen door. Her eyes were wet and furious. "Mom," she whispered, "you do not have to listen to a single word of that. I will not let them." "Not tonight, sweetheart," I said, and I touched her cheek. "Let everyone go home." The guests left in ones and twos over the next hour, the way they do after something has cracked open in a room and nobody has the courage to name it. There were the long hugs, the held hands, the eyes that said "I am so sorry," without the words ever arriving. A fisherman named Earl, who had brought me his first catch of the season for 30 years, gripped my shoulder at the door and said, "Lo." Walter would have flipped that whole table over, and I almost laughed because he was right. Ruby Aldous was the last to leave. 88 years old. She let her granddaughter help her into her coat, And then she stopped in front of me and looked up with those clear, dark eyes that had watched the harbor and the people of this town for the better part of a century. "I have been eating your cooking since 1985, Ruby said. "I know the difference between a woman who is finished and a woman who is only quiet." She patted my hand once, dry and warm. "You are not finished, Eleanor. Good night." And then it was only me and Tom. My son stood by the cold fireplace with his coat over his arm, unable to leave and unable to look at me. He had Walter's height and Walter's hands, and somewhere along the way he had traded his father's backbone for something softer, something that bent in whatever direction Sloane pointed. The circles under his eyes were dark. Something had been sitting heavy on him for a long time, and only now, in the wreckage of the evening, did I begin to wonder what it was. "Mom," he said. His voice was rough. "I am sorry. I did not know she was going to do it like that. Not here. Not tonight." "But you knew she was going to do it," I said quietly, not cruelly, just the truth laid on the table between us. He did not answer. He looked at the floor, and that was answer enough. "Go home, Tom," I said. "Go home to your family." He left. I stood in the doorway and watched the taillights of his car disappear up the dark hill away from the harbor. And then I went back inside and locked the door. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. Not because crying would have been weak, but because I genuinely did not feel like it. What I felt instead was something older and steadier and, in its own way, far more dangerous. I felt clear. I moved through the restaurant, turning off the lights one by one, the dining room last, and I stood for a moment looking at the long table, at the guttered candles and the wine glasses with their dark rings, and the mismatched china that held 40 years of my life. The photograph of Walter behind the bar, laughing at something neither of us could now remember. "All right," I said to him softly. "You ready?" The room did not answer. Rooms never do. But I had spent 40 years in this one, and that night, standing alone in the dark with the harbor lapping at the pilings beneath the floor, I understood something they had all missed. They had been waiting for me to break. They should have been terrified. The house Walter and I shared sat a half-mile up the hill from the restaurant, an old white farmhouse with a porch that had gone gray and soft at the edges, and a kitchen window that looked down over the harbor. I drove home that night through the dark with my hand steady on the wheel of the old truck Walter swore would outlive us both. And when I let myself in the front door, the silence of the place came up to meet me the way it had every night for 26 months. Empty in a particular way. Empty where a person used to be. I made myself a cup of tea I did not drink and sat at the kitchen table, and I let myself remember, because I think you cannot understand what came next without understanding what came before. We had nothing when we started. I was 26 and Walter was 28, and we put every dollar we had, and a good many we did not, into that building on the wharf. The first winter nearly finished us. I remember standing at the stove at 4 a.m, my breath fogging in a kitchen we could barely afford to heat, stirring a pot of chowder by the light of a single bulb, because we could not pay for more. My hands cracked and bled from the cold and the work. They have never fully healed, those hands. Look at them now, and you can read 40 years in them. Every burn and scar a sentence in a story nobody ever bothered to read. That was the thing about my life. Nobody read it. Walter stood at the front, and the town loved him. And they were right, too, because he was a good and warm and generous man. But it was my recipes that filled the seats. It was my hands in the dough before dawn. My judgment about which fish to buy and which supplier was cheating us, and which young cook had something worth teaching. When the bank threatened to call our loan in 1989, it was me who sat up 3 nights running the numbers until I found the way through. When we nearly expanded into a second location in 2006, it was me who smelled something wrong in the deal and said no. And we were proven right 18 months later, when the man who did expand lost everything. I made 1,000 decisions that nobody ever put my name on, and I told myself for 40 years that this was enough. That being the foundation was enough, even if no one could see the foundation. I told myself that the quiet work mattered whether or not anyone noticed it. But here is what I had let happen in the 2 years since Walter died. I had begun to believe my own smallness. I had let the quiet curdle into something else. When Sloane spoke to me slowly, as though I might not understand, I had started to wonder if perhaps she was right. When Tom signed papers and made decisions and did not ask my opinion, I had told myself it was natural, that the young must take over, that an old woman should be grateful to rest. I had looked at myself through their eyes for so long that I had nearly forgotten how to see myself through my own. That is the danger nobody warns you about, not the cruelty of others, the slow erosion of your own certainty, the way you can be talked out of your own size, one small dismissal at a time, until you genuinely cannot remember the woman who once stood up to a bank president and a fish wholesaler and won. I sat at that kitchen table until the tea went cold, and I thought about Sloane's smile and her 60 days, and the way Tom would not look at me. And slowly, underneath the hurt, something began to harden. Not anger, exactly. Something more useful than anger. The beginning of clarity. Because the more I turned it over, the less sense it made. The restaurant was not failing. I knew that the way I knew the smell of bread going stale. I had run those books for 40 years, and even in my quiet, even half watching, I had seen the seats full on weekends and the summer tourists lined up down the wharf. A hospitality group does not make a wonderful offer for a failing restaurant. And Sloane, whatever else she was, did not do anything that did not benefit Sloane. The story she had told the room did not match the numbers I carried in my bones. There was something underneath it. There was something she wanted badly enough to humiliate a widow at her dead husband's anniversary dinner to get. And I did not yet know what it was. And then, sitting there in the dark of the kitchen we had shared for 40 years, I remembered the box. Walter had shown it to me once, years ago, in the back of the closet of his study upstairs. An old tin box, the kind that once held tea or biscuits, fitted now with a small lock. He had pressed the key into my hand and folded my fingers over it and said, in that quiet voice he used only for things that mattered, "This is just for us. Ellie, do not open it unless you have to." And I had laughed and asked why I would ever have to. And he had given me a look I did not understand at the time, a look that seemed to see something I could not yet see. I had not thought of that box in years. The key had hung on my ring the whole time, small and forgotten among the others. I stood up. My knees ached the way they always did, and the house creaked around me, and the harbor whispered against the rocks below. I went to the stairs and began to climb toward Walter's study, toward the closet, toward the small locked tin he had told me not to open unless I had to. I had to. Walter's study had not changed in 26 months. I had not been able to make myself change it. His reading glasses still sat folded on the desk, beside a book he would never finish, a slip of paper marking the page he had stopped at. The room still smelled faintly of him, of cedar and old paper and pipe tobacco he had given up smoking 30 years ago, but somehow never stopped carrying. I turned on the lamp, and the soft yellow light fell across the things of a man's life, arranged exactly as he had left them. And for a moment the grief came up so fast and so hard that I had to put my hand on the back of his chair and simply breathe. Then I went to the closet. The tin box was where it had always been, on the high shelf at the back, behind a stack of folded sweaters that still held the shape of him. I had to stand on the small wooden step stool to reach it, and my knees protested. And for one foolish moment I heard Walter's voice in my head, telling me to be careful. "Ellie, let me get that." And I had to stop and breathe again. Then I brought the box down and carried it to the desk and sat in his chair, which I had not done since he died, and I fitted the small key into the lock. It turned easily. He had kept it oiled. Even this, even a thing he had told me not to open, he had cared for, the way he cared for everything that was mine. Inside was a folder, and inside the folder were documents. And on top of the documents was a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in his quick, slanting hand. Just my name, Eleanor. As though there could be any other Eleanor in the world this was meant for. I did not open the envelope. Not yet. Something in me was not ready for whatever Walter had needed to say to me from beyond the grave. And I think some part of me understood that a letter you are told not to read until you have to is not a letter for the ordinary bad days. It is a letter for something specific, something he had seen coming that I had not. So instead, I read the documents, and as I read them, the quiet kitchen of my certainty began, very slowly, to fill with light. The first was the deed to the restaurant, the building on the wharf, the land it stood on, all of it. I had not looked at this paper in more than 20 years, not since the lawyers and accountants had been swarming during a tax restructuring back when the boys were small. I remembered signing things in those days, dozens of things, trusting Walter and trusting our old lawyer Arthur to steer us right. What I had not remembered, what I am not certain I had ever fully understood, was what they had quietly arranged. The deed was in my name, mine alone, not jointly with Walter, not held by the family business. Mine. I read it 3 times to be sure my eyes were not inventing what I wanted to see. Eleanor M. Whitcomb, sole owner, recorded with the county in the spring of 2001. Walter had done it on the advice of the accountant, for reasons that had something to do with taxes and liability, reasons that had seemed dull and technical at the time, and that he had mentioned to me afterward over supper, the way he might mention he had picked up the mail. Oh, I had that thing with the property taken care of today, and I had nodded and passed him the potatoes, and we had talked about something else. For 23 years that fact had sat in a tin box in a closet, patient and quiet and completely forgotten. And his daughter-in-law had stood at his anniversary table and given his widow 60 days to leave a building that the widow had owned, outright and alone, the entire time. Underneath the deed was something else, a second set of papers, newer, and these made my breath catch in my throat. They concerned the recipes, the lobster stew, the brown bread, the blueberry buckle, the chowder, all of it, registered as intellectual property, the name Whitcomb's Wharf trademarked, and every bit of it filed under my name, and my name only. Walter had done this too, and recently, the documents dated only 3 years before he died. I had not known. He had never told me. Why would a man trademark his wife's recipes and put the restaurant's very name in her sole keeping, quietly, without a word, 3 years before his heart gave out? I sat back in his chair. The lamp hummed. Down the hill the harbor moved against the rocks in the dark. The same sound it had made every night of my life here. Walter had known something. I understood that now with a cold clarity that ran all the way through me. Not the shape of it, perhaps, not the names or the numbers, but the bones of it. He had looked at our family and our future and seen something I had not let myself see, and he had spent his last quiet years building a wall around me, a wall I did not even know was there, made of deeds and trademarks, and a locked tin box, and a sealed letter he had told me not to open until I had to. I looked at the envelope with my name on it. My hand drifted toward it and then stopped. Not yet. There were things I needed to understand first, things I needed to confirm with my own eyes in the light of day, before I let Walter speak to me from inside that envelope, because I had the strange, certain feeling that once I read his words, there would be no going back to the quiet woman I had been. I put the documents carefully back in the folder. I left the letter where it was. Then I looked out the dark window toward the harbor, toward the restaurant that had been mine all along, and for the first time in 2 years, I did not feel small. I felt like the foundation, and foundations do not move. I did not sleep that night, and yet I woke clearer than I had in 2 years. There is a particular kind of rest that comes not from sleep, but from purpose, from the moment you stop drifting and finally know which direction you are going to walk. I rose at 5, the way I had risen at 5 for 40 years, and I stood at the kitchen window watching the harbor come up out of the dark, the masts of the fishing boats taking shape one by one against a sky the color of a mussel shell. I made coffee, real coffee, strong the way I liked it, not the weak, thin thing I'd been making for one person, because strong coffee for a widow alone had felt like a kind of excess. That morning, it did not feel like excess. It felt correct. At 6:40 in the morning, I picked up the telephone and called Arthur Penhallow. Arthur had been our lawyer for more than 30 years. He was 70 now, mostly retired, a widower himself, and he had come to Walter's funeral in a suit that had seen better days and wept without apology in the back pew, which had told me everything I needed to know about the man. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with sleep but alert underneath, the way a good lawyer's voice is always alert. "Eleanor," he said. He did not ask why I was calling at such an hour. 30 years had taught him that I was not a woman who called at dawn for nothing. "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right, Arthur," I said. "I need to see you this week, and I need you to tell me something first, before I come." "Ask," he said. "The restaurant," I said. "The deed, the trademarks on the recipes, the name itself. I found the box. Arthur, the tin box. I read what is in it." There was a long pause on the line, and in that pause I heard a great many things. I heard a man choosing his words with care. I heard beneath that a kind of relief, as though something he had been carrying for a long time was finally being set down. "So you found it," he said at last, quietly. "Good. Walter told me you would, when the time came," he said. And I am quoting him directly here. "Eleanor," he said, "she will know when she needs it. She always knows." I had to sit down. I lowered myself into the kitchen chair and pressed my free hand flat against the table to steady it. "Tell me it is real," I said. "Tell me I read it correctly." "It is real," Arthur said. "Every word of it. The building and the land have been in your name alone since 2001. The recipes and the trademark on the name Whitcomb's Wharf were registered to you in 2019. Walter came to me himself to do it. He sat in my office for the better part of an afternoon, and he was very clear about what he wanted and why." "And why?" I said. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "Why did he do it, Arthur? Why would he build that wall around me and never say a word?" Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think that is a conversation for when you are sitting across from me, Eleanor. But I will tell you this much now. Walter loved you more than any man I ever met loved his wife, and he was not a fool. In the last years, he saw things in your family that worried him. He never told me the details. He was too loyal for that, even to me. But he wanted to make certain that no matter what happened, no matter who tried what, you could never be moved out of what the two of you built. He used those exact words. She cannot be moved. I closed my eyes. Down the hill, the first boat engine coughed to life, and a gull called over the water, and the ordinary morning went on as if nothing in the world had changed, while inside my kitchen everything had. There is something I have not told you yet, I said, last night at the anniversary dinner. Sloane stood up in front of the whole town and announced that the restaurant is being sold to a hospitality group. She said it is failing. She gave me 60 days to step away. She called it rest. The silence on the other end of the line changed. It sharpened. When Arthur spoke again, the sleep was entirely gone from his voice, and what was left was something hard and old and watchful. The restaurant is not failing, he said. It was not a question. No, I said. It is not. I have run those books in my head for 40 years. Arthur, the seats are full. The summer was strong. There is no reason on earth for a healthy restaurant to be sold out from under the woman who owns it, unless someone has a reason they are not saying out loud. Eleanor, Arthur said slowly, and now there was real weight in it. If Sloane and Tom have been making decisions, signing things, moving money, on the assumption that the restaurant belongs to the family business and not to you personally, then we need to look very carefully at exactly what they have been doing. Because every one of those decisions may have been made without any legal standing at all. And if money has been moving in ways it should not, that is a far more serious matter than an unkind speech at a dinner. I want to look, I said, all of it, every number. I want to understand exactly what has been done. Then I am going to bring someone with me, Arthur said. A young woman from a firm I trust. She does forensic financial work. She finds the things people hide. Should I be worried, Arthur? I asked. Not for yourself, he said. But yes, Eleanor, somebody should be very worried indeed. Arthur's office sat above the hardware store on Camden's main street, up a narrow flight of stairs that smelled of old wood and floor polish, in a room with a window that looked down on the harbor. I had climbed those stairs many times over 30 years for the boring necessary business of a life, wills and deeds, and the paperwork of growing old. I climbed them that Wednesday morning with my back straighter than it had been in 2 years, carrying a folder of my own, the documents from the tin box, and something I had not carried in a long while, which was the certainty that I belonged in the room I was walking into. Arthur met me at the door with both hands and the grave expression of a man who had been thinking hard since dawn. and beside him stood a young woman I had not met. "Eleanor," he said, "this is Nadia Brooks." She was perhaps 35, with sharp, dark eyes and a quiet, unhurried way of holding herself that reminded me, oddly, of myself at that age, back when I was the one who ran the numbers nobody thanked me for. She had a leather case and a laptop, and the steady calm of a person who has spent years finding things that other people worked very hard to bury. She shook my hand firmly and looked me directly in the eye, which I appreciated. Too many young people speak to a woman my age as though she has already left the room. We sat at the long table by the window. I set my folder down and slid it across to them. The deed, the trademarks, the registration of the name, all of it. Nadia opened it and went through the pages quickly, her A's moving with a focus that missed nothing, and when she had finished, she looked up. "This is clean," she said. "There is no ambiguity here. Mrs. Whitcomb, the property, the name, the recipes, they are yours, solely and without question. Whatever anyone may have believed or claimed, the law is not confused about who owns Whitcomb's Wharf." Then she said something that landed in me like a stone dropped into still water. "Which makes me curious," she said, "about what exactly the people who thought they owned it have been doing with it." I told them everything then. I told them about the 60 days and the hospitality group and the speech at the anniversary dinner. I told them how Tom had stopped asking my opinion, how Sloane had slowly taken over the ordering and the books and the hiring over the past 2 years, how she had eased me out of my own kitchen, one small decision at a time, while I was too sunk in grief to fight it. I told them about the things I had half noticed and not let myself examine. An invoice that did not match the delivery. A supplier I had never heard of appearing on a statement. Money that seemed to leave the accounts faster than the business could explain. Nadia listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small, neat hand. When I finished, she asked, "How long have you noticed these things?" "About 8 months, I admitted, on and off, when I had the strength to look at the mail, which was not often. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself an old woman half blind with grief should not be second-guessing her own son. She looked at me for a moment. "Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, "the things you just described to me are not the worries of a confused old woman. Those are good questions. Those are exactly the right questions. Most people would not have noticed any of it." "I have been helping run a business for 40 years, I said. "I simply never did it from the front of the room." Something passed between us then, between this sharp young woman and this old one, a kind of recognition. She nodded slowly, as though she had just revised an estimate of me upward. And I think from that moment on, Nadia Brooks understood she was not working for a victim. She was working with a partner. Arthur leaned forward. "Eleanor," he said gently, "before Nadia begins, I have to ask you something. and I need you to think about it honestly. Once she starts pulling on these threads, we may find things you cannot unfind. If Tom is involved, and from what you have described, he almost certainly is, then this will not only be a matter of an unkind daughter-in-law, it may become a matter of your own son. Are you prepared for that? Because there is no halfway in this. Either we look or we do not. It was the hardest question anyone had asked me in 2 years. Harder even than the questions the funeral home had asked me about Walter. I sat with it. I thought about Tom as a boy, gentle and patient, the way he had held his baby sister so carefully, the way he had come to me at 16 with a problem he was ashamed of, and how I had sat him down at the kitchen table and told him that the measure of a person is not whether they make mistakes, but how they face them. I wondered whether he remembered that. I wondered whether he had thought of it at all in the past 2 years. And then, just as my daughter Grace appeared in the doorway, having driven up the moment I called her that morning, her face pale and set and loyal, I heard myself answer. "Yes," I said, "I want to look. All of it. Every number, every name, every signature. I want to understand exactly what was done, and how, and when, and then I will decide what to do with it." Nadia closed her folder and met my eyes. "Then let us begin," she said. "For 9 days I did the hardest acting of my life. I went to the restaurant the way I always had, tied on my apron, tasted the stew, corrected a young cook's hand on the brown bread. I let Sloane believe she had won. I let her think I was a tired old woman counting down 60 days to a quiet retirement, packing up 40 years into cardboard boxes. I smiled at her in the kitchen, and I went home each night and met Nadia's questions in the dark. What I learned in those 9 days was that you can stand in the center of a thing your whole life and still not see the rot until someone hands you a flashlight. Nadia had asked me for everything: the old ledgers, the bank statements, the supplier invoices, the boxes of paper I had let Sloane manage, because managing paper was the part of grief that felt impossible. I had not wanted to look. After Walter died, opening the mail felt like climbing a hill with no top to it, and I had let it pile up, let other hands take it, told myself that was what family was for. I understood now that my grief had been a door someone walked through. There were people inside that kitchen who still belonged to me, though not to Sloane. Marcus, the dishwasher who had been with us 11 years, who Walter had hired when no one else would, the bookkeeper's assistant, a quiet girl named Tessa, who noticed more than she ever said. They did not ask questions. They simply set things aside for me, slid a folder across a counter, told me which invoices had felt strange to them, even when they did not have the words for why. People know when something is wrong in a house. They feel it before they can name it. On the 9th day, Nadia called me at 20 minutes past 9 in the morning. I was standing at my own kitchen window, the one that looks down the hill at the water, and I will remember where I stood for the rest of my life. She did not waste my time with softening. She said, "I found a company that does not exist." The name was Harbor Crest Provisioning. On paper, it had been selling us seafood and dry goods and table linens for about a year and a half. The invoices were tidy, professional, a few $1,000s at a time. The kind of number that does not make anyone look twice. Nadia had run it down. There was no warehouse. There was no boat. There was no truck that had ever pulled up to our back door with a single crate of anything. Harbor Crest. Provisioning was a name on paper and a bank account, and money had been flowing into it steadily. Payment after payment, for goods that had never once crossed our threshold. I asked her when it had started. She told me the company had been incorporated, and the first invoice paid, exactly 8 months after Walter died. I had to sit down. I found the chair at my own table without quite seeing it. 8 months. I tried to remember where I had been 8 months after I buried my husband, and I could not, because those months were a gray smear. A time when I let other people drive and sign and decide, because standing upright took everything I had. Someone had looked at my grief, measured it, and waited exactly long enough for me to stop watching. They had built a fake company out of nothing and pointed it at the heart of the restaurant Walter and I had bled for. And they had done it while I was still learning how to sleep in a bed that had become too large. Nadia was still talking, calm and even, the way she always was. She told me the loss from Harbor Crest alone was far more than a few $1,000s, that the small invoices added up to something I would need to brace myself for. And then she said the thing that turned my stomach to stone. She said, "This is not the only one. There is at least one more company doing the same thing. Maybe 2. I am still tracing them, but the pattern is the same, and the same hands keep appearing on the approvals." I asked her whose hands. She said she was not ready to say a name out loud until she could prove it, and that she would never hand me a name I could not stand behind in a room with a lawyer present. But she told me to prepare myself, because she did not believe a person could build something this careful, this patient, this cruel, without help from inside the family. A stranger does not know how long to wait after a funeral. Only someone who watched me grieve would know that. I stood back up and looked out at the harbor, at the boats coming in with the morning catch, at the same gray water Walter and I had looked at for 40 years, while we decided whether we could afford to keep the lights on. The restaurant was full every weekend. Tourists lined up on the wharf in July. Nothing about it was failing, and yet I had been told for 2 years that it was, and I had nearly believed it. I told Nadia to keep going. I told her to find every cent, every company, every signature, and not to spare me a single number. She said she would have more within the week. She said the next part might be the hardest, because tracing the money meant tracing the names that had approved it, and she had a feeling I already knew where that road led. I hung up the phone and I stood in my kitchen, and for the first time since Walter died, the thing rising in my chest was not grief. It was something colder and steadier, and it had a direction. The week that followed was the strangest of my life, and I have lived through some strange ones. By day, I was the retiring owner, gracious and slow, letting Sloane move through my kitchen as though it were already hers. By night, I sat at my own table with Grace, the two of us bent over photocopies under the low light, learning the shape of the thing that had been done to us. I had not wanted to bring Grace into it. A mother spends her whole life trying to keep the ugliest weather away from her children. But Grace had her father's eye for a number that did not belong, and after the first evening I understood that I could not do this without her. She would arrive after she put her own daughter to bed, a thermos of coffee in one hand, and we would spread the papers across the oilcloth and work until the harbor went black outside the window. It was Grace who found the second and third names. Nadia had warned me there was more than one, and there was. Harbor Crest. Provisioning was the first, the seafood and the linens that never came. But there was also coastal linen and hospitality services, billing us for laundry and table service that overlapped, impossibly, with the real linen company we had used for 20 years. And there was a third, the quietest of them, a name that sounded so respectable it almost slid past us. Pembroke Consulting. It billed for advice. Strategic consulting, the invoices said, in amounts of a few $100s at a time, for guidance no one in that kitchen had ever received. 3 companies. 3 names that did not exist in any way that mattered, each one drawing a steady thread of money out of the business Walter and I had built with our hands. Grace laid the invoices out in 3 rows across the table, and looking at them lined up like that, I understood for the first time that this was not a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a design. Someone had sat down and built it, piece by patient piece. We began to trace the approvals. Every payment a restaurant makes leaves a trail, a signature or an initial, a name that says, yes, pay this. Grace ran her finger down the authorizations and read the names aloud, and the same one kept rising to the surface. Sloane Whitcomb. She had been added as a financial manager about a year after Walter died, a change I had signed off on without truly understanding. In those months when signing things felt like the only way to make people stop asking me questions. Payment after payment. Her name said yes, but she was not alone on those pages. And this was the part I had braced for and still was not ready for. Tom's name was there too. My son had signed off on the ghost payments. Not once, not by accident, but again and again across the better part of 2 years. The handwriting was his, the careless slant I had watched develop since he was a boy doing his homework at this same table. There was no version of the story I could tell myself in which he had not known. A man does not sign his name to 2 years of payments to companies that do not exist and call it a mistake. I had spent weeks telling myself Tom was weak, that he was a coward, pulled along by a wife stronger and colder than he was. I had let that story comfort me, because a weak son is a son you can still forgive. But the names on those pages told a harder truth. He had not merely failed to stop it. He had helped. Grace put her hand over mine. She did not say anything. There is nothing to say to a woman who is learning, line by line in her own son's handwriting, exactly how far he was willing to go. We worked later that night than any other. Somewhere past 11, Grace pulled an older folder toward her, documents from the first year after Walter died, the legal paperwork that had reorganized how the business was run. She was checking it the way she checked everything now, slowly, looking for the names. And then she went quiet in a way that made me look up. She slid a scanned page across the table to me and pointed, not saying a word. There was a signature at the bottom. Eleanor M. Whitcomb, my own name, in what looked at first glance like my own hand. It sat beneath a document I did not remember signing, a document that granted broad financial authority over the restaurant's accounts to Sloan. I stared at it. I had signed so many things in those gray months. I told myself I must have signed this too, that I simply did not remember, that grief had swallowed it the way it had swallowed everything else. But something about it would not let me look away. The longer I looked at my own name, the less it looked like mine. Grace asked me quietly if I remembered signing it. I told her the truth, which was that I did not remember much from that time at all. But I picked up the page and held it closer to the light, and I felt the floor of my certainty begin to shift beneath me. I had signed many things I should have read. That was my failing, and I owned it. But this was something else. This was a feeling, low and cold, that I had not signed this at all. I set the page down. Grace was watching my face. Outside, the harbor was black and the town was asleep. And at my own kitchen table I sat looking at my own name and feeling, for the first time, that I did not know whose hand had written it. I told Grace I needed Nadia to look at it. Not tomorrow. Now. I stared at the signature on the screen for a long time. Eleanor M. Whitcomb. It was a fair imitation. Someone had studied my hand and learned the way I looped the capital E, the slight downward slant I had carried since girlhood, the way I crossed the double L in Whitcomb with a single impatient stroke. Someone had practiced. You do not get a signature that close by accident. You get it that close by sitting down with a sample and copying it again and again until your own hand forgets itself and learns to be another woman's. But it was not mine. I knew it. I knew it the way you know your own face in a mirror, the way you know your own voice on a recording even when it sounds strange to you. There were small wrongnesses all through it. The pressure was too even. My hand, after 40 years of kitchen work and a touch of arthritis that had come on since Walter died, no longer wrote with that smooth confidence. My signature shook now, just slightly, in the way an old woman's signature shakes. This one did not shake. It was the signature of a younger, steadier hand pretending to be old, and failing in the one way it could not have known to fake. "What is this document?" I asked Grace. My voice was very quiet. She read it carefully, scrolling up to the top. "It is an authorization," she said, "dated about 1.5 years ago. It grants expanded financial authority over the restaurant accounts." She paused, and I watched her face change as she understood what she was reading. It is the document that gave Sloan the power to move the money in the first place, and it is signed by you, authorizing it. Mom, this is the key that unlocked everything. Without your signature granting that authority, none of the rest of it would have had any standing at all. I sat back. The pieces were turning over in my mind, slow and cold and terrible. I never signed this. I said, I have never seen it before in my life. I know, Grace whispered. I know you did not. She reached across the table and took my hand, and I realized my hand was trembling, though not with the small tremor of age. Something larger had hold of me now. I called Nadia that same night, late as it was. She answered on the second ring, as though she had been waiting. I found the signatures, I said. The ones you would not tell me about. The ones on the early documents. There was a pause. Then she said, carefully, so you have seen them. My daughter found one tonight, I said. An authorization that grants financial power over the accounts. It is signed with my name, Nadia. I never signed that paper. I would stake my life on it. I know, Nadia said. And the way she said it stopped my breath, because it was not the soothing way a stranger reassures a frightened old woman. It was the flat, certain way of a professional stating a finding. I have been looking at it for 3 days, she said. That is what I was not ready to tell you on our last call. I needed to be sure before I put words to it, because of how serious it is. I had a forensic document examiner look at it, a specialist. She compared it against a dozen samples of your genuine signature from over the years, things Arthur had on file, your real deeds, your real tax filings, things you actually signed. And I said, and it is a forgery, Nadia said. Not a case of you signing something in haste without reading it. A deliberate forgery. The examiner is willing to stake her professional reputation on it under oath. The signature on that authorization was never made by your hand at all. It was traced and copied, line by line, by someone who sat down with samples of your handwriting and practiced until they could counterfeit it. This was not carelessness on your part, Mrs. Whitcomb. This was intent on someone else's. The room seemed to go very still around me. I had braced myself for theft. I had braced myself, even for the betrayal of my own son. But this was something else, something colder and more deliberate than I had let myself imagine. They had not merely stolen money from a grieving widow. They had reached into the very grief itself. They had taken the worst season of my life, the months when I could barely lift a fork to my mouth, the months when I trusted whoever put a pen in my hand, and they had sat down in private and forged my name onto the very document that handed Sloan the keys to everything. There was no innocent version of it. That was what settled into me as Nadia spoke, cold and final. A person does not accidentally trace another person's signature. A person does not practice a widow's handwriting by mistake. Somewhere, in some quiet room, while I was sitting in the dark, unable to function, someone had laid out samples of my hand and copied them with patience and care. and then used that counterfeit to take what was mine. It was not a moment of weakness. It was the work of hours. It was a decision made, and then carried out, and then hidden. Forging a signature to seize control of someone's assets, Nadia said quietly. That is not an unkind speech at a dinner party. That is a felony, a serious one, and the deliberateness of it, the practice involved, takes away any possible defense that it was a misunderstanding. I closed my eyes. I thought of Sloane's smile across the anniversary table. Mom, I know this is a lot to take in. How much do you think they took in all? I asked. I am very close to the final number now, Nadia said. I will have it within a few days. But Mrs. Whitcomb, before I tell you that, I think the time has come for you to read whatever your husband left for you in that box, because from everything you have described, I do not believe Walter was guessing. I think he knew exactly what kind of person had married into your family, and I think he left you that letter for precisely this night. I looked across the dark kitchen, up the stairs, toward the study where the sealed envelope waited, with my name on it in Walter's hand. You are right. I said, it is time. I did not read the letter that night after all. I want to be honest about the order of things, because the truth is rarely as tidy as we would like it to be. I had told Nadia it was time, and I had meant it. But when I climbed the stairs to Walter's study and stood with my hand on that sealed envelope, something stopped me. I was shaking too hard. The discovery of the forgery had done something to me that the theft alone had not. It had taken the grief I had carried for 2 years, the soft, heavy grief I thought I understood, and it had turned it into something with edges. And I knew, standing there with the lamp throwing its yellow light across Walter's desk, that I should not read his last words to me in the grip of that. He deserved better. So did I. I put the envelope down, and I went to bed, and I lay awake until the harbor turned silver with dawn. The next morning I drove to Arthur's office, and Nadia was already there, and I sat down across from the two of them and made them lay it all out for me again, slowly, in the cold, clear light of day, so that I could hold it without trembling. The forgery, I said. Walk me through it once more. I need to understand exactly what they did. Nadia opened her case and spread the documents across the table. The genuine signatures and the forged one side by side, and an enlarged photograph the examiner had prepared. My real hand and the false hand, magnified so that even an old woman's eyes could see the difference. And as she walked me through it, the picture assembled itself with a terrible precision. There is no innocent reading of this, Eleanor, Arthur said quietly. I want you to understand that, because I know a part of you is still hoping there is. This was not a paper you signed in your grief without reading. The examiner is certain. The pen never touched this page in your hand at all. Someone sat with samples of your signature and traced it, deliberately, with care, and then used it to grant Sloane authority over accounts that were never hers to touch. And as Arthur said it, I let myself finally remember the months it had come from, because I had been avoiding the memory the way you avoid pressing on a bruise. In the months after Walter died, while I was lost in grief. Tom had come to me again and again with papers. I remembered it now, the way you remember a fever, in fragments. He would sit beside me at the kitchen table with that gentle, careful voice and say, "Mom, there are just some things that need your signature. The bank needs them. The accountant needs them. It is all routine. You do not need to read every page. You are exhausted. Let me help you." For a while I had wondered whether the authorization had been slipped into one of those stacks, signed blind. But Nadia had taken even that small mercy from me. The signature on the authorization was not mine at all, blind or otherwise. It had been counterfeited, which meant that the gentle visits with the papers, the soft voice, the "let me help you," had not even been necessary for this one. They had simply sat down somewhere private, away from me, and forged my name. They had not needed my hand at all. They had only needed my grief to keep me from ever looking. I want you to understand what kind of cruelty that is, because I did not fully understand it myself until I sat in Arthur's office and made him say it plainly. There is the cruelty of a stranger, which is bad enough. There is the cruelty of greed, which is older than money itself. But this was a particular and intimate cruelty. To do this, Sloane had to look at me in the worst season of my life, see a woman hollowed out by loss, barely able to function, and recognize in that ruined state not a person to protect, but a weakness to exploit. She had to sit somewhere quiet with a sample of my handwriting and practice being me. She had to sit across from me at holiday dinners afterward, knowing what she had done, calling me Mom, accepting the food I cooked with my own hands, and feel nothing. And my son had stood beside her and let it happen, and worse than let it happen, had helped keep me too comforted and too soothed to ever look closely. I felt the anger rise then, not the hot kind. I have never been much for the hot kind. It was the cold kind, the kind that comes up through you like iron setting in a mold, slow and complete and permanent. It settled in my chest, and it did not move, and I understood that it was not going to move until this was finished. Arthur was watching me with the careful eyes of a man who had known me 30 years. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I have to tell you what this means legally, because it changes things. A forgery of this kind, deliberate, practiced, used to seize control of assets, is not a family dispute. It is a felony. If you choose to pursue it, and the evidence is strong enough that you certainly could, your son could face criminal charges alongside his wife. I will not make that decision for you, but you need to know it is on the table." I sat with that. My son in handcuffs. My son. The boy I had taught that the measure of a person is how they face their mistakes. I thought of Grace, and of my grandchildren, and of the wreckage that a courtroom would leave behind that no verdict could ever repair. "I do not know yet," I said at last, "what I will do with this, But I know I am not finished looking. I want the whole picture first. Arthur, the complete number, everything. And then I will decide. Nadia closed her folder. You will have it in 3 days, she said. All of it. Good, I said, and I stood, and I felt the cold iron in my chest hold steady and sure, because that night I would finally be ready to read what Walter had left me. I drove home from Arthur's office the long way, out along the coast road where the cliffs drop down to the water and the spruce trees lean inland from a lifetime of wind off the Atlantic. I needed the time. I needed to let the cold thing in my chest settle into something I could carry without it carrying me. There is a danger, when you have been wronged as deeply as I had been, of letting the wrong become the whole of you. I had watched bitterness eat a person from the inside until there was nothing left but the grievance. I did not intend to let that happen to me. Walter would not have wanted it, and more to the point, I did not want it for myself. So I let myself feel all of it, honestly, because feelings that are not let in have a way of leaking out sideways later. I felt the grief first, and it surprised me, because it was not grief for Walter this time. It was a fresher grief, sharper at the edges. It was grief for Tom, for the son I had believed in. You do not stop loving a child because the child has failed you. And I think that is the cruelest part of all of this, the part nobody warns you about. The love does not switch off. It simply has to learn to live alongside the knowledge of what they have done. And the two of them, the love and the knowledge, do not sit comfortably in the same chest. They ache. And then I let in the anger, because it was honest too, not for myself. Strangely, the money mattered less to me than people might think. What the anger was for was the calculation of it. They had not done this in a moment of weakness. There had been a plan, a company set up, a signature studied and practiced. A grieving woman watched and measured and found to be the right kind of broken. That was what the coal iron in my chest was made of. Not the loss of money, but the discovery that to the woman who called me Mom, I had never been a person at all. Only an obstacle. Only a problem to be solved. I let myself feel it for the length of the coast road, and then I put it away, not because it was not real, but because raw anger is a fire. It burns hot and bright and then burns out and leaves you with ash and a ruined house. What I needed was not fire. What I needed was the cold, steady iron you forge a tool from, something that would hold its edge through everything that was coming. By the time I pulled into the dooryard, I knew what I was and what I was not going to do. I was not going to scream. I was not going to give Sloane the satisfaction of a scene she could later describe as proof of how unstable poor Eleanor had become in her grief. Cruelty was her currency, not mine. But neither was I going to be quiet. Not anymore. There is a difference between the quiet of strength and the quiet of surrender. and I had let mine drift from one into the other without noticing, and the noticing had cost me dearly. What I wanted now was not revenge. I wanted the truth out, the structure corrected. Every person who had sat at that anniversary table to understand exactly what had been done and by whom, I wanted justice, the real thing, not a performance of it. I went inside to make myself a cup of tea before I climbed the stairs to the study, and that was when I found it, on the kitchen counter, where I kept the basket of mail I had not had the heart to sort in weeks. There was a plain envelope with no stamp and no return address. My name on the front in a hand I knew as well as my own. Tom's hand. He must have left it during one of his visits. Slipped it into the basket where he knew I would not look too soon. Inside was a single sheet, and on it, in my son's cramped writing, were 3 lines. A company name I had not yet heard, Pembroke Consulting, an account number, and beneath them, only this: Mom, I am a coward. I cannot say it to your face, but you should look here. I am sorry. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table and held the page for a long time. I did not know yet what to make of it. A part of me, the hard, cold part, wanted to call it too little and too late. A man trying to ease his own conscience without paying the price of saying the words out loud. And perhaps it was. But another part of me, the part that had taught a frightened 16-year-old boy that the measure of a person is how they face their mistakes, recognized something in those 3 lines. He had not been able to stop himself. He had not been able to confess. But somewhere in him, buried under 2 years of fear and Sloane's careful architecture, a thread of the boy I raised was still pulling. He had left me a map, in secret, to the very thing that would undo them both. It did not absolve him. Nothing would. But it told me that he was not entirely lost. And a mother holds on to a thing like that whether she wants to or not. I put the page in the folder with Nadia's findings. It changed nothing about the evidence, which she had already found on her own, but it changed something in me. It told me that when this was finished, there might be a door left open, narrow and difficult, but a door. Then I climbed the stairs to Walter's study, and I sat down in his chair, and I turned on the lamp, and I picked up the envelope with my name on it in his quick, slanting hand. And this time, my hands did not shake at all. I broke the seal. I broke the seal at my kitchen table, the same table where Grace and I had spread the evidence night after night. And I unfolded 4 pages covered in Walter's handwriting. I knew that hand better than my own. 43 years of grocery lists and love notes and figures scratched in the margins of menus. Seeing it again, filling 4 full pages, was like hearing his voice come back into a room that had been silent for 2 years. He had dated it. The top of the first page read a little over 5 years ago, a quiet autumn while he was still strong, still standing at the front of the house every night, greeting the regulars by name. I had not known all that time that he was sitting somewhere writing this and folding it away for a day he hoped would never come. He began the way he always began, plainly. He wrote, "Ellie, if you are reading this, then the thing I was afraid of has happened, and I am not there to stand between you and it. I am sorry for that. I wanted to be there, but I have learned that the only protection worth anything is the kind that holds up after you are gone." He told me he did not trust Sloane. He had never said it to me while he lived, and reading it, I understood why. He knew how I was. I would have argued. I would have defended her. I would have told him he was a suspicious old man seeing shadows where there were none, because Tom loved her and I wanted to love what my son loved. So he had said nothing to me. He had watched instead. He wrote about the small things he had noticed across the years. The way she counted the till when she thought no one saw. The way she asked questions about the deed, about the will, about who owned what. Questions dressed up as concern, but always circling the same center, like water finding the drain. The way she was warmest in front of an audience and coldest when the room emptied. None of it was proof, he wrote. Any one of those things is nothing. But I have spent 40 years reading people across a dining room, and I know the difference between a person who wants to belong to a family and a person who wants to inherit one. So he had built a wall, quietly, where no one could see it. He wrote that he had gone to Arthur alone, that he had put the deed in my name where it had always been, and made certain it could never be moved. And then he had done the thing I had not understood until Nadia explained it to me. He had taken our recipes, the lobster stew, and the brown bread and the blueberry buckle, the things that were not written down anywhere but in my hands, and he had registered them, the trademark, the name Whitcomb's Wharf, all of it under one name, Eleanor M. Whitcomb, mine, and mine alone. He explained why he had kept it secret even from me. He wrote, "If I had told you, you would have told Tom, because you cannot help loving your children out loud. And if Tom knew, Sloane would know. And a wall that everyone can see is not a wall. It is a fence, and fences are made to be climbed. So I built mine in silence, and I told only Arthur. And I am sorry to have carried something this heavy without your hand on the other end of it. But some weights a husband should carry alone." Then he wrote the part I read 3 times before I could move past it. He wrote, "Here is the thing they will never understand, Ellie, and it is the thing that will save you. They think the restaurant is the building. They think it is the wharf and the dining room and the sign over the door. And they think if they own those things, they own us. But you and I know the truth. The restaurant is your hands. It is 40 years of knowing exactly when the stew is done by the smell of it. It is the recipes that live nowhere but inside you. A person can buy the building. Anyone with money can buy a leaky old building on the water. But the building without you is just walls and weather. It is worth nothing. You are the asset. Ellie, you always were. I only made the paper say what was already true. I set the pages down. Outside, the harbor was dark and still, and I sat in the lamplight understanding, for the first time, fully, what the hospitality group thought they were buying. They thought they were buying a name they could franchise, recipes they could print on a corporate menu, a brand they could stamp on a dozen restaurants up and down the coast, and every bit of it, every word and every dish, belonged to me. Without my signature, they were buying an empty room. Walter had seen it all coming. He had reached forward through 5 years and 2 years of grieving and put a weapon in my hands, and I had not even known I was holding it. I picked the pages back up. There was more. There was a 4th page, and I had not yet read the part where he stopped talking about the restaurant and started talking about me. The 4th page was different. The first 3 had been the careful work of a man protecting his wife, all deeds and trademarks, and the cold logic of a wall built in silence. But on the last page, Walter stopped being the man who guarded the front of the house, and he became my husband again, the one who had stood beside me in a cold kitchen at 4 a.m. 40 years ago and told me we could do this. He wrote, "Ellie, I need you to hear the next part, because I know you, and I know the thing they will try to do to you when I am gone. They will try to make you small." I had to stop reading. I set the page against the table and pressed my hand flat over it, the way you hold something down in the wind. He went on. He wrote that he had spent 40 years watching me believe I was the one in the back, the one who cooked while he charmed, who scrubbed the pots while he shook the hands, who stayed in the kitchen where the work was hard and the credit was thin. He wrote, "You always called yourself the one in the back, and I let you, because you said it like it did not hurt, but it was never true. You were never in the back. Ellie, you were the foundation. I was the part of the house that people see. You were the part the whole house stands on." He wrote about foundations then, in that plain way he had of making a thing simple enough to hold. He wrote, "Nobody ever looks at a foundation. It is underground. It is unglamorous. People walk across it for 40 years and never once think about it. They only learn it is there the day somebody tries to build something on top of it that it will not hold. That is when the foundation speaks. And when it speaks, Ellie, it does not shout. It simply refuses to move. You cannot be moved. They are going to learn that the hard way, and I am sorry I will not be there to see their faces when they do." And then the last lines, the ones I have carried with me every day since. He wrote, "You will know what to do when the time comes. You have always known. The only thing that ever stopped you was letting other people tell you that you did not. So when they tell you that you are tired, that you are confused, that you should rest and let the young ones handle it. I want you to remember whose hands built every plate that ever left that kitchen. You will know what to do. You just have to stop letting them tell you that you do not. I wept then, not the tight, controlled grief I had carried for 2 years, the kind you swallow in front of the bank and the customers and your own children. This was different. This was the clean kind, the kind that washes something out of you instead of locking it in. I cried for Walter, for the years he had spent guarding me without my knowing, for the silence he had carried alone. And somewhere in the middle of it, the crying turned into something else, something steadier, the way rain turns to clear sky if you wait long enough. Because he was right. I had known all along. I thought about the bank president in 1989, the one who had wanted to call our loan in a bad winter. How I had sat across his desk with cracked hands and a folder of numbers and would not leave until he changed his mind. I thought about 2006, the expansion deal that smelled wrong to me when it looked good to everyone else. How I had said no and been proven right inside a year. I thought about every 4 a.m, every burn, every batch of stew I had judged done by smell alone because the recipe lived in me and nowhere else. That woman had not gone anywhere. She had only been buried for 2 years under grief and other people's voices. And now she was standing up. I knew exactly what to do. I would not scream at Sloane. I would not give her a scene to play the victim in. No public collapse for her to spin. I would do what Walter had done. I would build it quietly and let it hold. I would invite them to a dinner, my dinner, in my kitchen, and I would set the truth on the table one piece at a time. The deed, the trademark, and the recipes. The forged signature with the examiner's word beside it. Nadia's final number, every dollar of it. And Walter's letter, if it came to that. Though I thought I might keep that one for myself. I folded the 4 pages along the creases Walter had made 5 years before, and held them a moment against my chest. Then I reached for the phone. It was nearly midnight. Arthur answered on the second ring, the way a man answers when he has been half expecting the call for weeks. I said, "Arthur, it is time. Bring everything. Have Nadia finish her number, the whole of it, down to the last dollar. We are going to have a dinner." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me what kind of dinner. I looked out at the dark water, at the lights of the wharf below, where 40 years of my life were waiting. And I told him the truth. "The dinner," I said, "will be the reckoning." Arthur and Nadia came to the house 2 days later, on a gray afternoon, with the first real cold of autumn pushing in off the water, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Grace and I had pieced together the shape of the theft, and Nadia laid the final accounting in front of me. She had warned me on the telephone that the number would be hard to hear, and she was right, though by then I had braced myself for almost anything. $412,000, she said. That is the total across all 3 companies. over a period of 18 months, $412,000, drained out of Whitcomb's Wharf through invoices for goods that were never delivered and services that were never rendered, beginning 8 months after Walter died and continuing until just a few weeks ago, when the activity suddenly stopped. It stopped, I said. Why would it stop? Around the time of your anniversary dinner, Nadia said. My best guess is that once Sloane believed she had won, once she thought the sale was certain and you were on your way out the door, she no longer needed to siphon small amounts month by month. Why steal in the dark when you are about to take the whole thing in the light? Or perhaps she grew cautious. Either way, the timing tells its own story. $412,000. I let the number sit in the room with us. It was a great deal of money, more than Walter and I had cleared in some of our hardest years. And yet it was not the number that held me. What held me was something Nadia said next, the last piece, the one that turned the whole picture over and showed me its hidden face. There is one more thing, she said, and Mrs. Whitcomb, I think this is the part that matters most. I have been trying to understand the sale itself. Why a hospitality group would want this particular restaurant badly enough to move so quickly. So I did some quiet digging into the buyer, and what I found is that they are not interested in the building. They have a dozen waterfront properties already. They do not need a leaky old restaurant on a wharf in Camden. Then what do they want? I asked, though somewhere inside me I already knew, because Walter had told me in his letter, in his quiet, certain hand. They want the name, Nadia said, and the recipes. Whitcomb's Wharf is known up and down this coast. The brand has 40 years of reputation behind it. Their plan, as best I can reconstruct it, is to license the name and the signature dishes and roll them out across all their properties. A Whitcomb's Wharf in Portland, in Boston, in every harbor town with tourists and money. The lobster stew on 100 menus. They are not buying a restaurant. They are buying a brand. Arthur leaned forward then, and there was something almost like satisfaction in his old face, the look of a lawyer who has watched a trap spring shut on the people who set it. And here is what neither Sloane nor the buyer ever bothered to check. Eleanor, he said, the name Whitcomb's Wharf is trademarked. To you, the recipes are registered as your intellectual property. To you, Walter saw to all of it in 2019. So this hospitality group has been negotiating to buy a brand that the seller does not own and cannot legally transfer. Sloane has been promising them the one thing she has no right to give. Without your signature, without your consent, they cannot use the name on a single menu. They cannot serve your lobster stew under your restaurant's name anywhere in this country. The entire deal, the thing she humiliated you to clear the way for, is built on nothing. It is a house with no foundation. I sat very still and let the truth of it move through me, and I will tell you, there was a kind of justice in it, so clean and so complete that it took my breath. They had looked at me and seen an old woman in the back, an obstacle, a problem to be removed, And the whole time, the only thing of real value in the entire enterprise was the very thing they were trying to throw away. Without me, there was no brand. Without my hands and my recipes and my name, the building on the wharf was just wood and pipe, and a roof that leaked over the corner table. Walter had been right down to the last word. They had forgotten to ask what they were actually buying. The power, I said slowly, was mine the entire time. It was, Nadia said, it still is. Nothing they have done changes the fact that you hold every card that matters. The theft is a crime they will have to answer for. But the sale, the thing they staked everything on, you can stop it with a single word, because it was never theirs to make. I looked out the window at the harbor, at the gray water, and the boats riding at their moorings, and I felt the last of the fog lift from inside me. For 2 years I had let people tell me what I was. Now I knew. Now I had it in writing, in Walter's hand and the county's records and Nadia's careful accounting, all of it pointing at the same simple truth that I had been too sunk in grief to see. I want the dinner set for this Saturday, I said. The long table, the good china, all of you there, and Grace, and Ruby, and a notary, and Tom and Sloane. I will cook, and when the meal is over, I will give them my answer. Then I picked up the telephone and I called my son's house. And when Sloane answered in her bright, cold voice, I invited her sweetly to dinner. Saturday came the way important days always seem to come, quietly, with no particular drama in the weather, as though the world had not been told what was scheduled to happen inside my restaurant that evening. I woke at 5 out of 40 years of habit, and I lay in the dark for a while listening to the house, and then I rose and dressed and drove down the hill to the wharf before the sun was fully up. I wanted the kitchen to myself. I wanted, for this one last act, to be alone with the place that had been mine all along. I cooked all day. I want you to understand that I did not cook out of some need to play the gracious hostess to the people who had wronged me. I cooked because cooking was the truest thing about me, and because I would be damned if I let Sloane take that from me, along with everything else she had tried to take. I made the lobster stew that had been on our first menu 40 years ago. I made the brown bread my mother taught me. I made the blueberry buckle that Walter swore could end wars. The physical work of it kept me steady and kept me present. The chopping and the timing and the management of heat and salt and smell. And by the time the light began to fail over the harbor, the restaurant smelled the way it had smelled on the night of the anniversary, like a place worth coming home to. I set the long table myself, with the mismatched china, the same plates I had set 5 weeks before. I did this on purpose. If Sloane noticed the echo, good. If she did not, that was fine too. At my own place setting, I laid no folder, nothing to give away what was coming. The folders were in the kitchen, waiting. I had learned, across a lifetime of dinner rushes, that timing is everything, and you do not show the room the knife before the meal is served. They began to arrive as the dark came down over the water. Grace first, with a fierce, quiet look that told me she was ready for whatever the evening held. Then Ruby Aldous, 88 years old, helped through the door by her granddaughter, taking in the set table and the two unfamiliar professionals already seated with their cases, Arthur and Nadia, and looking at me with those clear, dark eyes and saying nothing at all, only nodding once, the way a person nods when they have come to witness something they have been waiting a long while to see. A woman named Diane Cho came too, a notary Arthur trusted, who settled at the far end of the table with her credentials ready and her manner discreet, because some of what would happen that night required a witness whose presence was official. And then, last, the way she always arranged to be last, Sloane. She came in wearing a dark blazer over a cream blouse, polished and controlled, and she was carrying, I noticed, the same slim leather portfolio she had carried to the anniversary dinner. That detail caught at something in me. She had brought the portfolio. Even now, even tonight, she still believed this was a negotiation. She still thought she had come to manage me, to soothe the difficult old woman and close out the transition on comfortable terms. She had no idea she was walking into anything at all. Tom came in behind her. My son looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. The circles under his eyes were dark, and he moved with the careful watchfulness of someone living with a low, constant fear. He saw Arthur first, and his jaw tightened. Then he saw Nadia, and something crossed his face, quick and almost hidden, but I was watching for it, and I caught it. Recognition. He had been in business long enough to know what a woman with a leather case and a careful manner sitting at a dinner table meant. He knew the look of a person who counts other people's money for a living. He looked at me, and I gave him a small nod, nothing more. Yes, the nod said, "This is what this is." The color went out of his face. Sloane, to her credit, gave away almost nothing. She kissed the air beside my cheek and said, "Mom, it smells wonderful in here," with the ease of a woman who had decided that confidence was armor and meant to wear it until the last possible moment. "Sit wherever you like," I told her pleasantly, and she chose a seat near the center of the table, across from Grace, who looked at her with an expression she was barely keeping civil. I served the meal. I had decided, very deliberately, to let the dinner happen, to not rush to the end. Part of this was practical. I wanted everyone settled, fed, off their guard, but part of it was something else. I wanted Sloane to sit through an entire meal not knowing when it was coming. I wanted her to wait, the way she had made me wait, the way her 60-day clock had been ticking in my chest for 5 weeks. We ate. The conversation was careful and thin. Ruby asked after the grandchildren. Tom pushed the food around his plate and did not eat. Sloane watched me across the candlelight, looking for the signal, the moment I would reveal what this evening was truly about, and I gave her nothing at all. I passed the bread. I asked Nadia, introducing her only as a colleague, where she had gone to school. The answer meant nothing to Sloane, because she did not yet know who Nadia was. But Tom knew. I could see him knowing more with every passing minute. His food untouched, his hands not quite steady on the table. At last the plates were cleared. The coffee was poured. The candles had burned low, dripping wax down the silver holders, just as they had on the night she had tried to move me. I placed my hands flat on the table, and the room grew quiet. "I want to thank you all for coming," I said. "I asked you here to give my answer to the question that was put to me at this table 5 weeks ago." And I looked directly at Sloane, and I smiled. Sloane met my smile with her own, that bright, practiced warmth, though I could see now the faint effort it cost her, the way a person holds a pose a moment too long, and you begin to see the muscle trembling underneath. "You wanted to talk about the future of this restaurant," I said, "about who has the authority to decide what happens to it. So let us talk about exactly that. I would like to start with something simple." I rose, and I went to the kitchen, and I returned with the first folder, and I opened it and slid a document down the table to Arthur, who passed a copy to Sloane and a copy to Tom at the same moment. "This is the deed to this building and the land it stands on," I said, "recorded with the county in the spring of 2001. I would like everyone to look at the name on the ownership line." The table was quiet. I watched Sloane's eyes move across the page, and I watched the precise moment they stopped, the small, almost invisible pause, a fraction of a second, before her expression reassembled itself. "That is my name," I said. "Only my name. It has been only my name for 23 years. This building was never owned by the family business. It was never a shared family asset in any legal sense whatsoever. It has always, every single day, belonged to me alone." "Eleanor," Sloane began, "that does not necessarily mean what you think it." "I am not finished," I said, quietly. She stopped. I returned to the kitchen and came back with the second folder. "This," I said, "is the registration of the trademark on the name Whitcomb's Wharf, and the filings that establish the recipes of this restaurant as my intellectual property. The lobster stew, the brown bread, the chowder, all of it, registered to me, and to me alone, by my husband in 2019. I slid the copies down the table. I watched Sloane's face as she understood what she was looking at, and for the first time something flickered there that was not warmth and was not calculation. It was the beginning of fear, because Sloane was clever, and a clever person does not need everything spelled out. She had built a sale around a name and a set of recipes, and she had just been handed the proof that neither of them had ever been hers to sell. "And this," I said, and I took the envelope from the third folder. "This is a letter written by my husband, Walter, in October of 2019, witnessed and notarized, and held in Arthur's files for the past 5 years. He wrote it to me and I have chosen to read one part of it aloud, because I believe everyone at this table deserves to hear it. The room was utterly silent, even Sloane. I unfolded the pages, and my hands did not shake, and I read the part where Walter wrote about the restaurant not being the building, about the only thing of real value walking home up the hill every night, about how anyone who bought Whitcomb's Wharf and thought they had bought a restaurant had bought a leaky building and a name they could not use and recipes they had no right to. I read the line that mattered most. They look at you, and they see an old woman in the back, and they never once think to ask whose hands the whole thing was built with. Grace made a small sound and pressed her hand to her mouth. Ruby had her eyes closed. Tom sat with both hands flat on the table and his head bowed, and I could see from the rigid line of his shoulders that he was holding himself together with great effort. I refolded the letter and set it down. I have one more thing to share, I said, and this one is the hardest. I looked at Nadia. She opened her case and produced a bound report, clean and professional, tabbed and thick, and she placed a copy in front of Sloane and a copy in front of Tom without a word. This, I said, is a forensic financial report, prepared over the past several weeks by my financial analyst, drawing on the records of this restaurant, which I had every legal right to examine as its sole owner. I paused. It documents in full detail, with every source document attached, the systematic theft of money from this business through 3 companies that do not exist over a period of 18 months. The total amount is $412,000. Both of your names appear as the authorizing signatures on the payments. The room came apart. Ruby's granddaughter gasped. Grace was on her feet. Tom had not moved, but his head had sunk lower. This, Sloane said, and her voice was tight now, the warmth entirely gone. You cannot simply produce a private report and make accusations like this. This is. The source documents are attached, Nadia said. It was the first time she had spoken since the meal began, and her voice was perfectly level, the voice of a person who has presented hard findings to people who did not want to hear them many times before. Every transaction is itemized with the corresponding bank records, the corporate filings, and the signature authorizations. You are welcome to have your own accountant review it. The numbers will not change. Sloane set the report down very carefully, and then I watched her gather herself, watched the armor go back on, and she lifted her chin and said, in a voice meant to reclaim the room, "Whatever you think you have found, everything Tom and I did was for the family, for the future. The business needed restructuring, and the conventional channels were too slow. And stop," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Something in the single word, flat and complete and certain, closed her mouth. "Do not," I said, "sit at this table, his table, and tell me that stealing from what Walter built for 40 years was an act of love. I will not carry that insult quietly, And before you say another word, Sloan, there is one more page in that report I want you to turn to. The one that is not about money at all." Her eyes dropped to the report, and Nadia said, softly, "Page 204. The page about the forged signature." Sloan looked down at the report I had set before her, at the place where her own signature sat beside the one that had been made to look like mine. The examiner's words were printed plainly beneath them, the kind of language that does not soften anything. For the first time in 15 years, I watched her composure leave her. The color drained from her face the way it drains from a person who has just realized the floor is not where they thought it was. Her hand, resting near her coffee cup, began to tremble, and she pressed it flat against the table to stop it. I did not enjoy that moment the way I once imagined I might. I had spent 2 years being told I was tired, that I was confused, that I should rest. I had every reason to want to see her undone, but sitting there in the kitchen Walter and I had built, watching a woman discover that her foundation had never existed, I felt something quieter than triumph. I felt the steadiness of a person standing exactly where she belongs. I told them what the document was. I told them that after my husband died, someone had taken my name, my own signature, and used it to seize control of a business that had been mine alone since the year 2001. I said the word that Arthur had taught me to say carefully: forgery. I told them that a forensic document examiner would testify under oath that the hand on that page was not mine, and that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a felony. It was then that Tom set down his fork. He had eaten almost nothing. He had been watching his wife the whole evening, the way a man watches weather coming in off the water, and now something in him gave way. He said my name. He said, "Mom." And then, in front of Grace and Ruby and Diane and Arthur and Nadia, my son began to tell the truth. He admitted that the restaurant had never been failing. He admitted that he had told me it was, that he had let me believe my life's work was slipping through my fingers. He admitted that he had known about the signature, that he had carried documents to me in the worst weeks of my grief, and watched me sign things I never read. And then he said the thing I had not expected him to say in front of everyone. He said that somewhere in the middle of all of it, he had tried to leave a door open. He looked at me and he said, "I sent you the name, Pembroke. I left it where you would find it. I am a coward, but I could not let it bury you completely." I felt the note in my pocket, the 3 lines in his handwriting, the company name and the account number, and the words, "I am a coward." I had kept it folded with Nadia's evidence. I understood now that he had written it the same week Nadia first spoke that company's name aloud, that some part of my son had been trying to hand me the thread, even as the rest of him held the knife. It did not make him innocent. A man who leaves a door cracked while the house is being robbed is still in the house, but it told me he was not entirely lost, and a mother holds on to that. Sloan turned on him then. her voice low and furious, telling him to stop talking, telling him he was throwing everything away. But the room had already shifted. Whatever authority she had carried into that kitchen with her leather portfolio was gone, and she could feel it. I told them how it would be. I said the sale was canceled, that the hospitality group would never own the name Whitcomb's Wharf or a single one of my recipes, because both belonged to me and would stay that way. I said that Sloane was removed from any role in the business effective that night, and that Arthur was holding the documents that made it final. I said that the $412,000 that had been taken would be repaid in full, on a binding schedule that the attorneys would set, with consequences for every missed payment. I told them I had not yet decided about the criminal side. The report existed. The examiner existed. I would carry that decision for as long as I needed to, and they would live knowing I held it. I was not interested in cruelty, but I would not pretend that what had been done could be erased by a quiet apology over cleared plates. Sloane stood. She gathered her portfolio, that same portfolio she had carried into my anniversary like a weapon, and now it looked like nothing more than a bag of papers that had stopped meaning anything. She left without another word, her heels sharp on the old floorboards, and the door shut behind her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ruby Aldous, 88 years old, reached over and patted my hand with her papery fingers, and in a voice only I could hear, she said, "Good girl." Tom stayed in his chair, his head down. The power in that room had moved across the table and settled where it should have been all along. I looked at my son, at the wreckage of what he had let happen, and the small, stubborn thread of decency he had tried to leave me. And I knew the hardest part was not behind me. It was only beginning. The morning the restaurant reopened under its own name and its rightful owner, I woke before dawn out of 40 years of habit, and for the first time in a very long while, I was glad too. The harbor came up silver out of the dark, the way it always had, the boats taking shape one by one against the pale sky, and I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of strong coffee and let myself feel, simply and completely, that I was still here. I said a quiet word of thanks to God for that, the way my mother taught me to, the way I had forgotten to for 2 long years. I will tell you how the rest of it settled, because I know you want to know, the way you want to know how any true story ends, even when the ending is not tidy. Tom resigned from any role in the business. He signed the repayment agreement Arthur drew up, 4 years of monthly installments, real and enforceable, and he has not missed a payment. He and Sloane are no longer together. I did not cause that, and I did not prevent it. Some structures, once you remove the foundation of lies they were built on, simply cannot stand. As for the criminal side, I made my choice, and I will keep it private, because it belongs to my family and not to the world. I will only say that I chose in a way Walter would have understood, which is to say I chose justice without choosing cruelty, and the two are not the same thing. and learning the difference between them was perhaps the hardest work of my whole long life. Sloan left Camden. The hospitality group withdrew its offer within a week of learning the truth, the way a tide goes out, quietly and all at once. The building on the wharf is still mine, still leaking over the corner table no matter how many times anyone fixes it, still smelling of bread before dawn. My daughter Grace runs it now, the day-to-day of it, the ordering and the hiring and the 1,000 small decisions a restaurant demands. She is cautious where her brother was reckless, careful where Sloan was grasping, and the books are honest now, which they had not been in 18 months. And honest numbers are always a better foundation than impressive ones built on fiction. I am there most days. I am not in the back anymore. I have learned not to put myself in the back. I sit where I can be seen, and I tell people whose hands built the place, because Walter was right, and it took me far too long and cost me far too much to believe him. And there is one more thing, the thing I think Walter would have wanted me to end on. Grace has a daughter, my granddaughter, 11 years old, all sharp questions and serious eyes, with something in the way she watches a pot come to a boil that reminds me painfully and wonderfully of a young woman I used to be. She came to me a few weeks ago, in the kitchen, early, before the others, and she asked me to teach her the lobster stew, the real one, the one from the first menu. It is not written down anywhere, she said. I looked. There is no recipe for it in any of the books. No, I said, there is not. There never has been. Why not? She asked. And I thought about how to answer her. This child who would carry whatever I gave her into a future I would not live to see. I thought about the deeds and the trademarks, the careful architecture of paper that Walter had built to protect what was mine. And I understood that none of that was the real inheritance. The papers protected the thing, but they were not the thing. Because some things you do not write down, I told her. Some things you keep in your hands instead. Your great-grandmother taught it to me the way I am going to teach it to you. Standing right here, watching, doing it until your hands know it without your head having to think. A recipe on paper, anyone can take. They can buy it or steal it or forge a name to get at it. But a recipe in your hands is yours. It cannot be moved out of you. No one can give you 60 days to leave it. She did not fully understand that last part, and that was all right. She would someday. So I took her small hands in my old ones, the ones with 40 years of burns and flour and early mornings written into them, the hands nobody ever bothered to read, and I showed her where to begin. And as she worked, frowning with concentration, getting it wrong and then less wrong, I felt the whole long story close itself like a circle. The woman in the back, the foundation, the hands passing to hands. I thought, God willing, she will be standing in this kitchen long after I am gone, and some part of me will still be here in her hands. They thought I had nothing left. They thought a grieving widow was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be moved, an old woman in the back who would go quietly when she was told to go. They forgot to ask whose hands the whole thing was built with. So let me leave you with this. Wherever you are sitting tonight, if you have ever been made small by someone who was supposed to love you, if you have ever let enough years of other people's certainty convince you that you are less than you are, hear what Walter spent his last quiet years trying to make me understand. The strength was always there. It does not announce itself. It simply holds until someone tries to build something dishonest on top of it. And then it tells the truth, solidly, without apology. I believe God does not waste a single one of us, not even the ones the world forgets in the back of the kitchen. I was 67 years old. I was a widow, and I was only ever quiet. I was never, for one single day, empty. If this story reached something in your heart tonight, do me one last kindness. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, and share it with one woman who needs to remember her own strength. Stay close and do not wander far, because I have more truths like this one waiting, and I would be honored to tell them